Good morning, members. Welcome to this Governance and Audit and Standards Committee meeting. I'm Leo Madden and I'm the chair of the committee. There are a few housekeeping things that I have to read out to you. If the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room and the public gallery by the stairwells. Do not attempt to use the lifts. Please assemble the Queen Victoria statue in front of the civic offices. In order to comply with the Guildhall Trust Fire Marshal regulations, if you sign into the Guildhall, please remember to sign out when you leave the building after today's meeting. Live web streaming. May I draw everyone's attention to the fact that this meeting will be live streamed and that the camera zooms in to show the speaker. This is linked to the microphones, therefore can I please remind all attendees to turn their microphones on to speak and then off again once you have finished speaking. Members of the public are also permitted to record the meeting on the understanding that it neither disrupts the meeting nor records those stating explicitly that they do not wish to be recorded. Please be advised that the public seating area is not in view of the camera used to webcast this meeting. So I'll go around and ask members to introduce themselves, if that's all right. Members, people here in attendance, so that'll be everybody. Shall I start, Peter?
Peter Bell, City Solicitor.
Chris Ward, Director of Finance.
James Harris, Senior Local Democracy Officer.
Paul Somerset, Deputy Chief Internal Auditor.
Elizabeth Goodwin, Chief Internal Auditor.
Helen Magri, Data Protection Officer.
David White, External Audit Manager for Manson Young.
Ian Fitchett, Electoral Services Manager.
Member start with Stuart.
Councillor Stuart Brown, Fratton Ward.
Councillor Judith Smythe, St Jude Ward.
Councillor Daniel Weems, Hillsey Ward.
Okay, thank you, members, for introducing yourselves. We'll go on to the agenda. We do have some apologies for absence, so I'll hand over to James.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received today from Councillor Dave Ashmore and Councillor Benedict Swan.
Okay. Could I then ask any of the members if they have any declarations of interest? Daniel?
It's not a declaration of interest, it's just to let you know that I need to leave at 11:30.
Listen, we'll all be going by 11:30. If you don't ask any questions or make any comments, and that goes for all the members, we'll be going 5 minutes, but I mean, that's life, isn't it? Okay, thank you, Daniel. Okay, members, can we move on to the minutes of the meeting of the 20th of July? Okay. I'll do them page by page. If anything jumps out to members, just jump in there. So I've got big page 7. Have members got the same? So that's what I'll use. Big page 7. Big page 8. Big page 9. I just had one in relation to fire drills and whatever, Lizzie. Is that... I didn't see it on the paper, it might well be there, but I mean, are you happy with what's happening on that at the minute, on the fire drills?
I think this relates to the emergency procedures and it should be contained within this report, but there was significant improvement to the extent I think we've closed exceptions. Okay,
thank you. And in relation to portico, so does that mean that you just get on with it? On the cash limits, there was no safe limit because the existing limit was not sufficient, so presumably that's been either upped by somebody or whatever.
There was an action put in place and we'll be following that audit up in this year's plan, so we'll report back when that audit's complete.
Okay, thank you. Anything else on page 9, members? Page 10? Page 11? Page 12? I presume, Chris, you will, the very last paragraph there about the rising cost of fuel, and whatnot, and also, of course, interest rates, presumably you will cover, if asked, at the question when your report comes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Members agree the minutes? Is it okay? Thank you. Okay. Could we then go to item, it's It's David's one, isn't it? Item 4. Item 4, I've got, James was at the meeting the other day. In fact, 3 of us were there, right? So it's, I hope it's not a bit of deja vu, but it's only the implications of the decision that was taken. So James has told me no matters have been referred to G and A and S at this point, as the Cabinet member will first take into account any observations by scrutiny management when reconsidering the matter. Should the scrutiny member be minded to refer the matter onto G and A and S before making a final decision, there may be a need to convene a special meeting of G and A and S in the coming coming couple of weeks. Peter Bulb, City Solicitor, is attending as lead officer if applicable. I think the scrutiny management the other day, to be fair, tried to sort of not impose but suggest dates for them. But by the Constitution, we have to the matter has to go back to the cabinet member, the relevant cabinet member, who then makes a decision as to whether it's going to be referred on to here. I suspect it will. And I was hoping that today we could maybe look at possible dates for a special meeting, but I'm afraid we can't do that, James, because we have to await the outcome of what the cabinet member does. So I think within a few weeks, in order to get a decision on it, we'll need to have another meeting, if that's all right, members. And so we'll canvass dates when we know when the cabinet member is going to deal with it. Is that okay? Lovely, thank you. We've got I should have read that, but a couple of answers. So 5 is external audit verbal update, change of risk assessment since presentation of the 21-22 audit planning report. David, are you going to speak to this, or is it all here?
Yeah, I can speak briefly to it, Chair, if that's helpful. Thank you. So our item is just a verbal item for today, and it's just a sort of fairly minor update to the audit plan that was presented to the committee in July. So at that point, we had in the plan an area of higher inherent risk, around infrastructure asset valuation. And we noted that we would discuss that further with management. We've now done that, and as a result, we need to increase it to an area of significant risk, and that's how it will be reported in the audit results report that will come to you in due course. The reason for that is just we've sort of now got a better understanding of the information that's available to the council to account for infrastructure assets, and in particular to de-recognise elements of the assets when new assets are added. And the size of the balance is such that there is a risk of material misstatement, at least of the gross figures, and potentially of the net book value of the asset in the accounts. What I would say is, though, that this is a common issue. It's something which is sort of arising through, and it's a developing issue at the moment, impacting a lot of councils. It's impacting those councils where the 2021 accounts are not yet signed, and it's impacting those where 21-22 audits are in progress. CITFA is looking at this issue across the piece with a view to potentially making retrospectively applicable changes to the Code of Audit Practice, which may or may not resolve the issue. We can't really second guess what the outcome of that will be at the moment. CITFA's website currently says they're expecting to issue an update on the matter in mid-September. We're now at the end of September, and no update has yet been forthcoming. So when that does come out, we'll look at it, we'll talk further with management, try to understand whether it might resolve the issue for this council. If it doesn't, the other thing that's being looked at is the department is potentially looking to issue a statutory instrument, which again might sort of override the expected accounting practice and provide some form of solution through that mechanism instead. Again, can't really second guess what that might say. It would be the same process of considering it, discuss with management whether it resolves the issue for Portsmouth or not. But as I say, this is not something which is particular to Portsmouth. It's common across the majority of councils which hold infrastructure assets, and it's as a result of the nature of the assets, the way that they are held in the fixed asset register en bloc, which makes it very difficult then to determine specific elements of the asset to de-recognise when new additions are brought into the accounts. It's really a balance sheet issue. There's nothing impacting the council's bottom line in arising from this matter.
Okay, thank you, David. It's one of those things that when you read it, you should have sleepless nights about, or certainly Chris Ward should. But it's actually a technical problem then, is it? That's really what it is. And so does it actually then, should the words significant risk then be used in these circumstances?
So from our perspective, the determination of whether something's a significant risk is around the size of the balance and the likelihood that it might be misstated by a material amount. There are qualitative considerations, but those quantitative considerations come into play sort of first. And we're required to give an opinion on all of the figures in the statement of accounts, whether or not they impact the council's actual sort of bottom line, usable reserves position, etc. So from that perspective, from our audit point of view, it is a significant risk. From the council's point of view, arguably perhaps not in terms of, how the council would be able to sort of operate on a day-to-day basis, but to say that it's not dissimilar to having our significant risks on some of the other aspects of property valuation that were in the audit plan as well.
So so with SITFA and everybody else involved, it will be resolved at some stage soon.
That's the $64,000 question, really. I think that, that I would think there will be some form of solution going forwards. Quite what form that will take or when it will be forthcoming remains to be seen. Whether there will be an answer that is applicable for 21-22 or those outstanding 2021 audits again remains to be seen, I think.
Okay, thank you, David. Any questions from members on item 4? No, item 5, sorry. Councillor Smythe, Judith.
Like you, I think this is looks terribly worrying written down like this. And of course, we're dealing with asset values that presumably are moving all the time anyway. It's a bit like sticking jelly to the ceiling, isn't it, in some ways? What I don't understand is whether the risk lies in the overall effect of misstating these things into the rest of the account and the knock-on effect there, or whether the risk lies because there's some underlying process that we're not doing correctly in order to be certain that we've minimised the risk. I wondered if somebody could just clarify that. You glibly said this is a technical issue, but they can be quite important. No.
I'm not saying no. Yeah. Oh, Chris.
Let me see if I can help provide a bit of clarity in not quite so technical terms. If we let's take an example. Let's say that all of the assets of the council are valued and they all sit on the balance sheet. All of the liabilities of the council are valued and they all sit on the balance sheet. If you, for example, said, okay, what is the value of the council? You would sell all of its assets, realise the cash, you would extinguish all of your liabilities, pay a load of money out, and what's left is the value of the council, really, and that's the balance sheet value. Now, some of our assets are not assets that you would necessarily readily sell, and you wouldn't as a local authority. So some of the assets that we're talking about at the moment might be your road infrastructure. So this might be, for example, we've just spent £1 million resurfacing the road, and we've spent another £100,000 putting in traffic lights and bollards and so on and so forth. The issue is that every time we make this capital expenditure, we add to the value of the asset, and that adds to the value of the council's balance sheet. But what we don't necessarily do is say, well, okay, now that you've added that, what have you effectively taken away from that asset into it by adding to it? So if you, let's say we replaced 20 bollards, for example, we'd be adding 20, but we haven't necessarily done the deduction of the 20 bollards. So that's the issue, really. But because often the valuation is done at an aggregated level, we haven't got, and neither has really any council in the country that deals with this, a process then to say, now we need to take off the bollard that's replaced. So it's the derecognition is the issue here. It's not the fact that we've got a problem in process of valuing the additions to the assets or the network. It's there is a process problem with how do you, when you make an addition or an enhancement or an improvement, how do you take away the value of what you've improved so that you haven't effectively got a double count? If that makes sense.
And presumably you would have to take away the liability against that bollard as well.
Or the deterioration, I was thinking.
Assume that a new bollard was... This gets very complicated.
Yeah, well, we do depreciate the asset each year. So every year we'll be saying the value of that asset that we put in 10 years ago has dropped, say, by 1/10. But we don't then say, well, it's got 2/10 left because it's 8 years old, and we've taken the 2/10 out.
But I mean, likewise, if you put in a new bollard, you've got to give it a new 10 years.
Exactly.
It seems to me this could really go up itself and not be terribly helpful, or because who's going to buy a bollard anyway?
Exactly. This is why it's explained as a technical issue. In the real world, it makes no difference to the way the council operates on a day-to-day basis. It will make no difference to the council's revenue budget, no difference to the council's capital programme or capital expenditure, but it will make a difference to how those assets that we have and have added to in the past are valued on our balance sheet. And this is obviously the auditor's concern, which is if our assets are misstated, then they need to be able to report on that.
I understand that, but I hope we can have some, that not too much time is wasted on that sort of thing, because actually, were we to have to sell we wouldn't sell our assets. Somebody would come in and manage the authority for us, and there'd be a straight book transfer of everything. I think sometimes these things go into the realms of fantasy, but thank you for explaining it so clearly.
I'm sure David wouldn't agree with the fantasy bit, would you, David? But these things have got to be sorted out, haven't they? And look forward to seeing a resolution of some sort, satisfactory to everybody. Okay, members, thank you. Item 6, please. Treasury Management Monitoring Report for the first quarter of 22-23. We have Chris Ward here. Chris is a S151 officer. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the usual quarterly monitoring report that you receive. The headlines of the report are that the council has remained within its authorised limits and indicators that were approved as part of the Treasury Management Strategy by full council back in March. I'll take the opportunity to just take you through the appendix in brief, I think, because that's probably the most helpful part, and I can take you through some of the individual elements. So every year the council has what's described as an authorised limit. That's the maximum amount of external borrowing that the council can take, and that's approved by council. You'll see that the council is within the what's called the authorised limit, which is the actual limit, and what's called the operational boundary, which is really an early warning sign to just to make sure that you've got mechanisms in place. It's an early warning mechanism if you're potentially going to get towards your authorised limit. So, council is well within that limit. In terms of what's called the maturity of the council's borrowings, i.e. when loans come up to be finally repaid, sometimes those loans have to be refinanced. And this is a measure to make sure that we don't have a large amount of borrowing that could potentially need refinancing all coming up at the same time. If it all comes up at the same time, then you're exposed to interest rates at that point in time. So we look at that over a period of time, make sure that we've got what's called a relatively even maturity profile so that we're not overexposed at any one particular time. And you'll see that we are within the limits that we set there across the whole 50-year period. So that's for the council's fixed rate borrowing, and it's a similar picture for our variable rate borrowing as well. We're well within the limits that were set for that. And then for surplus cash, so from time for the council is generally a cash positive organisation. So whilst we will always all of the funding that the council has is earmarked for a particular purpose and properly budgeted, we may from time to time have more cash. We have cash prior to when we need to expend it, and we invest that on the money markets to get a return for the council pending the spending of that money. There's a particular indicator that we look at, which is for amounts that are invested beyond 365 days. Obviously, anything that has a longer investment period carries more risk associated with it, so we set ourselves a limit for that, and you'll see that we are still well within the limits that the council has set itself. As an example, the first row there says at Q1 we had £55 million that matured after March 23. The limit was 125 million, so we're well within that limit. The rest of the paper does provides some information particularly around the financial climate. I think I would say at this stage what you see in terms of interest rate forecasts, put a line through that. Things have moved on quite considerably since the end of first quarter, not least the mini budget that happened last week and what that potentially might do to interest rates. So I think the interest rate forecasts we can probably safely assume are quite out of date at this stage, but there's a general upward trend in interest rates shown at the forecast at this point, and then interest rates kind of flattening out towards the end of the period to September 25. And I think the final thing that I would say is in terms of our actual investment activity, so these temporary surplus cash flows that I mentioned earlier on, you'll see that because interest rates are rising, then so are our returns on our invested money. That is reflected in the council's actual budget monitoring position, and for those of you that followed the cabinet meeting earlier this week, you'll see that there's a forecast improvement in our treasury management activities of around about £2 million as a consequence of two things really. One, our cash balances are higher than we originally forecast, and two, interest rates are on the rise as well. That's all I thought I would say by way of introduction, Chair, but obviously happy to answer any questions.
Well, thanks very much, Chris. I think I'm a bit worried. That was a very rosy picture, Chris. And is it rosy? I mean, is there nothing for us to worry about, no matter what interest rates go up to, because we'll be getting the money back in interest anyway? I mean, are we in a difficult situation, or can we manage with the current situation and the potential raising of interest rates and all the rest of it?
It's obviously quite a complicated picture, and you'll all probably know that interest rates are effectively a monetary policy tool that are used to try to control inflation. So the big concern is actually inflation. So the big concern for us is inflation, and obviously the control mechanism for that, or monetary control mechanism for that, is interest rates. So the council is experiencing significant inflationary impacts right across its budget at the moment. There was a report that went to cabinet earlier last week that said, as a consequence of inflation generally, the council is experiencing costs over and above its budget of in excess of £5 million in the current year, which is not insignificant, obviously. A large chunk of that relates to pay. So 3.8 million of that relates to pay. 1.8 million of that relates to energy. And when I say 1.8, that's the amount in excess of the budget. We had already assumed a level of increase in terms of energy, but not quite at the exceptional levels that we are seeing now. So we'd already assumed that energy inflation would cost us 1.4 million, but this is 1.8 on top of that. So in total, our energy costs have gone up by over £3 million in this financial year alone, which is quite a challenge. And that's actually concentrated in a relatively small number of areas. So it's obviously we feel the effects of that in all of our administrative buildings, and particularly on our leisure sites, heating swimming pools and so forth. So inflation is the big worry. If the government's response is interest rates, then yes, we tend to benefit in the revenue budget in relation to our treasury management activities, because the money that we put out in the markets for short-term periods attracts a greater rate of interest. But the converse to that is that it's always, rising interest rates are good for savers or lenders, if you like, and bad for borrowers. So when we then look at what does that mean for the council in terms of capital investment going forward, it will mean that where we do borrow, and we only borrow for investor save schemes, but investor save schemes are now going to become more expensive, and therefore the opportunities afforded to the council for any investor save schemes are going to be far more limited now, because the cost of borrowing is rising. So it's a mixed picture, but inflation is the dominant factor that causes the council a problem.
Okay, thank you, Chris, for that. Stuart, Councillor Brown?
Thank you, Chair. I was going to ask a very similar question. I think it's actually been answered.
Other points, members' questions? Councillor Smythe, Judith?
Thank you. Chris, you mentioned the 3.5 million of the costs above budget, 5 million were to pay. Was most of that not foreseeable in putting the budget together? And if not, why not? And some of it would be to be welcome because of the increase of pay for the very low pay.
If we go back to when the budget was prepared, so most of these estimates are done around January, mainly around January time. Energy is the easier one. I say the easier one. We had budgeted for some very significant increases in both gas and electricity. Are you talking about pay?
I'm not interested in energy at this stage. I understand what you say about energy. It's the pay. You said 3.8 million of the 5 million was for pay inflation.
Correct.
And I would have thought we could have forecast that and wondered why that has hit us so unexpectedly. Unless we've had a great turnover of staff and the market is...
No. I don't think anybody, at that stage, nobody was expecting inflation to be up in double-digit figures. We had budgeted for pay in total at around about 2.5%. The average, if the pay offer is accepted, and I know that Unison have now confirmed what their position is in terms of the pay offer. The average for this council would be 6.2%. It's a flat rate, obviously. Generally, it's £1,925 per person, but that averages out at about 6.2% in terms of pay. And when you factor in the impact then on national insurance contributions, it rises up to 6.8%. So it's quite significantly higher than anybody expected as a consequence of inflation generally.
I mean, I think you haven't mentioned, but I guess that includes the increase in the living wage that was announced by the government earlier on in the year, and we wouldn't have forecast that either, would we? So that must be in there somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, the big impact of the national living wage is in adult social care supplier uplifts. So that's kind of separate. That's a contracted increase in cost rather than internal pay. So yeah, that was factored into the budget, the national living wage. That was 6.6% from memory. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Is that all right, members? Thank you. Could I just one rather silly point, but if you look at the F5 and when market interest rates increase, there's a paragraph there which says this can be seen the first half of 2021 with the returns on below the deposit falling, but the returns were long-term managed funds that are structured nets. Now, I think that means rates. Or is it? Yeah, I thought it was a technical term, so that I'd never come across, Chris.
It is a technical term. It should say structured notes.
Notes?
Notes.
I hadn't saw the notes.
It talks about notes.
Earlier,
It talks
yeah.
about, I was caught by the same thing. I thought that's something I don't know what it is. But later on it talks about notes, and I guess there was a typo. That's right?
That's it, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I did look it up. It is a word.
What, nits?
Nets is a word, and if you're Forrest Gump, you might say...
Oh, nates. Yeah, I
buttocks.
see it now.
Buttocks.
Yeah, no, it should be structured notes.
So
Apologies.
it's not buttocks then?
No.
Okay. It's buttocks. It means buttocks, nets. Yeah. Yeah. All the words that you might want to use for your posterior. Anyway, no, I did think it was a technical term, so I looked it up. Thank you very much for that. Can we... So members are asked to recommend the Council's Treasury management activities have remained within the Treasury Management Policy 22-23 in the period up to 30th of June 22 be noted, and secondly, the actual Treasury management indicators as at 30 June 22 set out in Appendix A be noted. Is that all right, members? Okay, thank you very much. Can we now move on to item 7, the overview of Portsmouth City Council complaints, including local government and social care ombudsman complaints 21-22. I'll hand over to Charlotte. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This is our annual visit to this committee with the annual report around complaints. I've just a few points to note, really. You have noted from the report there is an overall increase in the number of complaints that we've handled this year. I think there's a comparison to the previous year when we think that the kind of numbers of complaints was artificially reduced as a result of the pandemic and the impact that had. But we do still have an increase on those pre-pandemic levels. So we had 531 complaints in 18-19 and 443 in 19-20 in comparison to over 600 this year. So we are aware that there is an increase. The LGO, I should say, does say that numbers of complaints do not necessarily indicate poor performance. It shows a council that's open to hearing from its customers rather than indicating a wider issue. But we are looking at the reasons around the increases. There aren't any particular trends, but we've just highlighted a couple of things. There were some changes to our rubbish and recycling collections in the year that the report relates to, and that resulted in quite a number of complaints because people's collection times and days and things changed. So those issues have been addressed. I think that's the important thing to note, is some of these areas where we've got higher numbers of complaints, those issues have been addressed and resolved by the services. We think there are a number of complaints around the kind of pent-up demand that the council experienced after the pandemic. And so examples include things like the backlog of planning applications, which has been well documented and we know has been and is being dealt with, and things like increased demand for services like housing support and needs and advice, those kind of things. So although there are no specific trends, there are general increases across the organisation where we have picked up higher numbers of things that we know that those issues are being dealt with or have been dealt with by the services involved. In terms of monitoring around complaints, so we introduced a new complaint policy last December, and as a part of that, and in line with best practice from the LGO, we've put quarterly monitoring reports in place now, so that we're keeping a track of and highlighting the trends around complaints up through the organisation to directors and senior leadership, so that any trends are kind of picked up during the year rather than coming through to this committee once a year, and that being the only formal monitoring. We're also working with directorates, as we constantly do, to improve adherence to the timescales that we achieve around our complaints. We made some changes to the policy, as you know, which reduced the number of stages around complaints from 3 to 2, which means we have longer now for each complaint stage, which is proving to be helpful in enabling directorates to deal with complaints properly within the timescales. So those adherence to the timelines is improving, and we'll continue to monitor that and seek to improve that further. In terms of the LGO complaints, very slight increase in the number of complaints made about the council to the LGO from 34 to 38, but we still perform well in comparison to other local authorities. We do not see significant numbers of complaints referred to the LGO, and when they are referred, very few are upheld. We've only got 4 uphelds from the period from the report, and we've got details of those included in the report for you. We'll continue to monitor that because we've moved from a 3-stage to a 2-stage process, which could, in theory, see more complaints referred to the LGO. So we'll keep a close eye on that to make sure that it's not having that impact, and making sure our complaint responses are as robust as they can possibly be at the 2nd stage. Hopefully that's a quick canter through. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Charlotte, thanks very much. Very comprehensive report. I've just got a couple of points, really. Could I, the top of, well, there were also 141 complaints linked to the timeliness of the Council's response to customers in 21-22. Now, it happens in all organisations, and certainly one that I worked for would ignore those as complaints because they have the original complaint and therefore follow it up. Is that really a complaint?
So the complaints that are related to timeliness of the council's response are not necessarily about the timeliness of response to complaints. It could be about the timeliness of response to any issue that's been referred to us. So it could be anything from how fast we've dealt with an issue that we've had highlighted to us about cleaning up something, or a road issue, or a housing repair, or so it's a kind of catch-all which refers to timeliness of response to any issue, which I think then links into that.
I would just suggest that it be changed to something like follow-up complaints or whatever on issues, because they're not really complaints. I put my complaint in, you've sent me a letter saying how it's going to be dealt with. You haven't dealt with it in that way, or I'm not happy with the response or whatever, so I'm putting another complaint in. So I just wondered, have a look at that, because I think could I just, and I just, the 4 that you've highlighted, the 4 ones that the Ombudsman said needed looked at, I mean, I've read them, and I can see where there's some human error in them, but I think the one that jumped out at me was the disabled grant, the disabled facilities grant. Well, somebody disabled is looking for a drop curb and a hard standing in front of the house. It's all simply been agreed by the relevant department, and yet nothing happens. Now, I hope that, and I'm dealing with one at the minute, which I've been dealing with for over a year, I have to say, and I might tell the resident to put a complaint in. But it just seems, so where are the fall downs? I think if it's one department, it seems to be fine, or one section. But I think when there's lots of people involved, it just seems to fall down. And I just thought this one was terrible for this resident. The other ones are not good either, but you know, I know these things go to the chief exec and the board and whatever, but do they actually, I don't know if I say this public, but do they send back their concerns about some of these or suggestions as how they might be dealt with? Because I just think, I'd like to see none going. I have to say, I'm a person that believes in the complaint procedure, and people saying, you know, I'm not happy with it, in order to improve our service, I hope, and make recompense or do whatever we're supposed to do. But I just find that one, well, have you any idea what they've actually done, and whether, once they got the ombudsman's referral back, that they did something immediately, or somebody did something immediately?
So, on that particular one, and I think this is it's always unfortunate when a complaint gets to the point where it has to go to the Ombudsman to be resolved, and we haven't necessarily as an organisation taken the opportunity to resolve those issues before it gets there. But around this particular one, I think it almost illustrates why it is really important that we have a complaint process and that customers are able to make complaints, because what it then triggers is what was necessary in this case was a review of the occupational therapy policy. So once these issues are highlighted through complaints, and then that enables them to be escalated into the directorate to the level that it needs to go to be able to be addressed. It's unfortunate that it ends up being through a complaint, but in this case they have updated their occupational therapy policy so that this kind of situation can't happen again. I agree with you. Where we do have complaints that go to the Ombudsman, quite often they do involve more than one area. And when we have things which cross over two areas, they become more complex and more likely to involve complaints like this.
I would just like to recommend, it's up to members, but I think that I would like at some stage a report back from the Chief Exec and the directors to tell us what they've done with these complaints and how they've dealt with them. Because, you know, fine, complaints can go to the Ombudsman, I have no problem with that, but it's what we then do afterwards. And it just, this poor person, you know, to be left in that situation, I found it very sad when I was reading it a couple of weeks back. But that's my opinion. Conscious Smile, Judith.
I absolutely echo what you're saying on this one, and I just was longing to know, did she get her hard standing and drop curb, and is it now working? I know that's not strictly speaking what the complaint turned out to be about. It was about the processes towards getting an occupational assessment. But I mean, the point was that she needed help and advice and some boxes ticking by the occupational therapy people, but it doesn't say that she actually got the drop curb and whether it's working all right for her.
Do you know, Charlotte?
I'm afraid I don't know whether she got the drop curb or not.
Could you just let us know by email or something like that? You
Of
raised
course.
the issue and, you know.
Of course.
Okay, Judith, thank you.
As written, this report looks like she might be still waiting.
Well, yes, I hadn't thought of that bit. I just thought
felt that was very distressing.
I just thought of the stress that she went through trying to have the issue resolved, yeah. Councillor Williams, Daniel?
Might not necessarily be a question, but it's more of a comment. Just looking at the Table 2 part of the trends by directorate, it seems to me like certain parts of certain directorates obviously have more complaints because there's more frontline customer engagement. But I'm just looking at children and families and education, there seems to be, in percentage-wise, Stage 2 and Stage 3 complaints. There seems to be more of them. With certain directorates, does it basically mean if there's a complaint made, it's more likely to be severe versus other directorates? Because obviously with housing, neighbourhoods and building services, there's well over 400. But with children, families and education, there's 29. But then with Stage 2, there seems to be 30%, 33% that gets to Stage 2, then 10% Stage 3, versus housing where, obviously I wouldn't know the percentages off by looking at it straight away, but there might be like 80% that finish at Stage 1 and then the next stage goes up. So I'm just wondering if a complaint's made to a certain director, it's more likely to be a severe one that gets to Stage 2 and Stage 3.
I think you're absolutely right. The children, families and education are more likely to have complex complaints, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the complaint will be escalated to the second stage of the process. But if we don't answer robustly every point of the complaint at Stage 1, then that's a justification for it to be escalated to Stage 2.
Okay, and it's more of just an idea really. So if children and families get that more complicated complaint, possibly they could give the other directorates maybe a best practice or some form of policy engagement between the different directorates. Because I'm just thinking if they get more complex cases, possibly they could help the housing, neighbourhoods and building services with their complaints and how they deal with them more effectively. I'm only saying this just because I know the Children, Families and Education Directorate, they do still have a massive amount of frontline customer engagement. So maybe that might be a suggestion.
Thank you. I'll pass that on.
So could I just say, just anticipating, so the bottom of page 3, I suspect, is the number, 139 complaints received about rubbish and recycling collections. The following changes to collection rounds. Do you then, we had to change the collection rounds because of the funeral of the Queen Elizabeth. Does that mean, do you expect to get complaints in about that then? And also the Saturday service could not be completed at time of remembrance. So is that the sort of thing people might complain about?
Yes, our residents do make complaints about rubbish and recycling collections.
No, do you anticipate any because we had to change things because of the funeral?
So yes, we are likely to receive some complaints because we changed the collection dates, and particularly if people feel that they haven't been adequately informed that the collection dates have changed. Those kind of things can generate complaints. But the ones that we had around the changes to collection dates, those were quite significant round changes where I think the contract was changed and the collections themselves were changed. So people had their collection days and things permanently changed, and there were some issues around that when it was implemented, and that's why those things have become actual complaints as opposed to people just letting us know that we've missed their bin, because if we've had a missed bin collection, we don't record that. That's not treated as a complaint unless it becomes something we do repeatedly.
The complaint, I know. Any other points, members? Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you for that. But I'm going to add one more recommendation. If members agree that we have an annual report at some stage from the chief exec and I forgot what it's called, the chief exec and directors, because they get quarterly reports on what they've done with the complaints that have reported to them, and if they've recommended any action or got annoyed with any of them or whatever. Okay, James. Is that okay, right, members? Can we note this report and that additional recommendation? Oh, I probably need seconded. I suppose it does. Oh, thank you, Daniel. Yeah. So that's seconded. All these official things. After Tuesday, I'm too scared to do anything. Because of the Constitution bit. But anyway, that's seconded. Do members agree to that? Is that okay? Thank you very much, members. Charlotte, thank you very much. So 8, we got data security breaches, and Helen's here for us. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the usual report we've been bringing to this committee, normally twice a year. Hopefully you've had a chance to have a look. I just want to draw your attention to a minor amendment to the original report. There are a couple of breaches relating to council tax which were attributed to corporate services in error. So they have been in the final report that's been published. They have just been moved to finance and resources where they correctly belong now. So the trends are generally consistent with previous periods. There is nothing particularly to note in this report that's unusual. We continue to see the highest percentage of breaches as a result of human error, and most breaches caused by emails being sent to the wrong recipient. We've got some additional information in the report this time at the request of the committee relating to children's social care. It's been highlighted by the committee that there tends to be a higher number of breaches reported from that area. So we've just provided some additional information around what we believe the reasons are and the actions that we're taking. They're not unique to children's social care, the actions that we take to follow up whenever there's a breach, but it outlines how we're trying to prevent similar breaches occurring in future. So
Okay, thank you, Charlotte.
Has any questions?
I think we do use this phrase human error, but I mean, could we call it carelessness in some situations?
Possibly, when we're sending emails to the wrong recipient. Yeah.
There's a couple of them that jumped out at me in the children and families, for instance. A member of staff access records without a business need to. Disciplinary action. In any organisation I've worked in, that would have been sacked. Do you know what does that happen in any of these cases? It's not the only one.
That has happened in the past. I don't know with this particular one. The HR process is not something I'm involved in, but we're clear that it would be a disciplinary process. The formal action policy is followed, and we will always report those to the Information Commissioner's Office, who can choose to prosecute those individuals. And we haven't had any of our own staff prosecuted, but certainly there are reports from other organisations where staff have accessed information either for their own gains or without a business need, and those individuals have been prosecuted and financial fines have been imposed. So that is our action if we are alerted to that happening. And we do have, particularly in children's social care, we have robust auditing that is routinely carried out. So they'll be looking at which cases individual members of staff have accessed against their caseloads, and where there are, where there are exceptions there. You know, if a member of staff has accessed a case that is not relevant to their caseload, then they will be required to explain why that's happened. So we're actively monitoring staff to make sure that doesn't happen. All staff in those areas sign specific declarations to say they will not do that. They have to be given access to systems, but we have to have an element of trust, and generally, you know, our staff are very trustworthy, but occasionally this does happen.
And just my last point, we're talking about currently working on the next phase of the rollout of Microsoft 365. After my experience of Microsoft meetings, I'm not too happy about that, but which will include data loss prevention tools. And then you're going to say the council's company would significantly reduce the number of errors. Would it not actually eliminate them, Helen?
I'm not sure we will always be able to eliminate those, but we will be able to create some bespoke rules or alerts. So if, for example, you were sending an email that contained somebody's national insurance number, the system would be smart enough to identify that email contained a national insurance number, and then we can set up a rule. So we can say, if an email contains a national insurance number, trigger an alert to warn the sender of that email that it contains that information, and to check who they're sending it to, or to check that they have actually intended to send that information. And we can create those rules practically around anything we want. So it could be medical terms, it could be particular volumes of data being sent. So it's something that we can create for ourselves. We've also obviously got to be meaningful. We've got to get a balance between not generating too many of those alerts so that they become meaningless, but making sure we focus on the biggest areas of concern and those that we feel will make the biggest impact on reducing data breaches. So that is something that we're working on actively now.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I look forward to see how it does manage. Councillor William?
I always get suspicious when I see 0 incidences on a number of different directorates. So there's none in the executive, and there seems to be none in culture, leisure, I think, and the Port Authority. That either means they're doing something really well or they're not doing something well. I just wanted to ask whether you think that they're being run effectively in terms of this data security and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, this report does rely on people reporting those breaches to us, but we actively communicate that through our corporate information governance panel that has representatives from all across the business. The importance of reporting breaches. We haven't been alerted to breaches in those areas, so sometimes a breach will come to our attention where a member of the public reports that something has happened, and we haven't had those reports in those areas. So.
Yeah. Because the only thing I would say on that is just because there's a large number of reports, it doesn't mean it's a problem. It's more about efficiency in certain areas. So I was just wondering, maybe in culture, leisure, they might not have such an efficient system versus children, families and education due to the severity of certain data breaches.
Yeah, I think certainly the mosaic system that is used in children's social care has all of this reporting functionality and auditing functionality, which some of our systems that we've been using for many more years perhaps doesn't have. So that may be a contributory factor, certainly.
Yeah, totally. And the other comment I would say about them sending an email to the wrong person, I've done that several times with people who often have maybe similar names. One example would be Councillor John Smith. I sent him a wrong email just because it's such a normal name. But yeah, no, that wasn't a criticism on any of the directorates. It was more just something I thought about in terms of displaying some of the issues that might occur in different areas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Councillor Smythe, Judith?
If we were to ever do a deep dive on this, I think it would have to be in children's, families and education. Sometimes the consequences of sharing information badly in that particular group is very, very poor. Also, just to link it back, it seems to me, it's an extraordinary coincidence that their figures here are 29 as a total, and the figures in the previous report for the number of complaints is 29. It cannot be anything but a coincidence. But one does think about what it is to the complaints report. I didn't mention this at the time, but we have the stage 1 is clearly failing in that of the complaints report, looking at page 5, and also we have this really quite large number of data protection breaches in this report, and we've also had the new mosaic system which you referred to. I'm actually quite surprised that there were so few complaints. Quite on that one, I didn't mention it earlier, and quite not surprised really that they've got so many more data breaches here, because the nature of the information they're dealing with is, if you're just dealing with if somebody bought a ticket for something or attended something, it's a very different sort of thing. And I would be quite interested in the relationship between the complaints and the data breaches, because it seems to me that many families in stress who are the subject of receipt of services in children's services may or may not be, they'll be differentially able to make complaints about data protection issues which they may not understand anyway. So I think I think there's kind of more work to be done under this, just to discover exactly what this is and whether it's a cause for concern. It would be worth making sure, for example, that Councillor Susie Horton, who does a really good job as the spokesman for education, is aware of these figures and takes them perhaps to her meetings, because I think they do deserve a bit more of a close look.
Sorry, I made the assumption that happened to all cabinet members, but I don't know. It doesn't. Do they just come here and sit here?
Yes.
Yeah. You see, I think that we ought to encourage Councillor Horton and the others actually, but to have a look at this, because they are anomalous in some way, and they're also dealing with absolutely crucial things to do with the children's health and safety and well-being, which arguably is a bit more important than a bin being missed one day.
I think that's right. Could you bring that up? Sorry, Lizzie wanted to come in, and then I'll. Yeah,
I'm not asking it to be brought up because I'm critical. I'm asking it to be brought up
just for them to see what if there's a problem.
Cabinet, where I still are spokesman for children and families, I'd want to have another look at it.
Okay.
Incidentally, on complaints, the complaints they ought to be both taken to her. The complaints for children's services are incredibly low, given the scope. Really, we should be looking at that. The number of complaints which are resolved before stage 2 is a success for the authority. It isn't just the ratio, which you pointed out quite rightly and very usefully. Only 16 complaints into children and families, which I assume takes in some of the complaints from parents at school. And I know that parents at school are often discouraged from making complaints because they feel their children will be victimised. It's the old problem. There's nothing new there.
Yes.
But what you want to see is, and the data breaches are relatively high compared with other places. I wonder if that is significant in the way that people are making complaints. If you get to a stage 3 complaint, or if you get to be one of these complaining about a data protection issue, then you really have got quite a long way down the road to being very, very unhappy.
Okay, Lizzie Goodwood wanted to make a point in internal audit. Lizzie?
I was just going to pick up, and in actual fact, it's not in relation to Judith, Councillor Smythe, your comments. But Helen, I wonder whether it is worthwhile from your perspective, and certainly from an audit perspective, one of the earlier comments or questions was around the fact that we've got 3 directorates to which there are nil return. It's probably fair to say the executive is tiny. The port has its own data protection officer, although they should be certainly reporting any of their data breaches through, so that you can obviously feed those through. My final comment would be from an audit perspective, and Helen can give her opinion from her visibility, the directorate that has the best processes for reporting is by far Children's Services. So the figures don't really reflect the fact that their reporting processes that they have in place when they believe they have had a breach are significantly more robust than some of the others, and that's not really reflected within this, if that helps and gives a little bit of context. I don't know if Helen wants to add anything further to that particular point.
I would totally agree. And I think Councillor Smythe, I would agree, and Councillor Smythe, you touched on another point. The kind of data and volume of data they're handling is very different to many other areas of the council, and I think that's a contributory factor and something that's written in the report there. But we can certainly make sure Councillor Horton has sight of the report, and really happy to work with her and with the Caldecott Guardian and Director to talk about those breaches and what can be done. Definitely.
I mean, I think all directors should have a help in, sight of these, because what's the point in it stopping with us? It won't result in action. This is a general term. I'm very well aware of the new computer system introduced into Children's Services, and that's now embedded in a much safer and potentially easier to use. So.
Yeah.
But then, you're dealing with life and death information for that group, and not, with all respect, for most of the other departments. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, if the are you just thinking of the cabinet member or the senior officers involved seeing these? I mean, I presume that they do, but
I don't know. But
actually, nor do I. And I was going to
hope it doesn't just stop here, because it's pointless.
I was going to suggest that since it's already established in relation to complaints, that the chief executive and the board look at those, that they look at these as well. On whatever basis it seemed necessary. And again, it'd be nice to have some feedback to us at whether it's on an annual basis as to what they've looked at and what they have thought needed changes or whatever. Is that okay, Helen? Can you, or James, do you do that?
I can certainly discuss with Lizzie Goodwin the best way of getting that information to the most senior officers and providing some feedback to you in future.
I'm not asking to load them with lots of information. They've had a lot to do as a board, but nonetheless, I think to us anyway, these complaints and how they're dealt with and whatever, and are taken seriously, and the breaches, we see them as important, and I certainly do. So I think of a senior manager viewpoint on whatever the process will be. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, if I were them, Chair, I wouldn't want the whole report. I'd want just the 2 or 3 tables that.
That's what I'm saying. I'm not being prescriptive. It getting
is interesting, and
yeah.
I think it shouldn't stop here.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, members. Thank you. What we're asking to do is to note this report. Is that all right, members? Agreed. Thank you. Thank you, Helen. We'll move on to the review of polling districts and polling places. Ian Fitchett here. Ian, I think I've had more emails on this subject than many others, but so I was well aware of what was happening, but thank you for that. And do you want to introduce it, Ian?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so the Council has a duty to keep polling districts, polling places under review. There's a statutory timetable for that. The next statutory review is not actually due to 2024. Wanted to undertake this review on an interim basis just to address some issues that have arisen over the last couple of years. In that intervening period, of course, we've had general election, very high turnout. We've also had our experiences from the COVID pandemic. We've also got half an eye on the introduction of voter ID requirements in May 2023. So those are the sort of areas that inspired us to undertake the review. We undertook a consultation from July. As part of that, the returning officer made some representations which included proposals for changes in Baffin's ward, Copner ward and Milton ward. We were looking particularly to address some issues with congestion where we have a couple of polling stations with particularly large electorates, and going back to the general election, we have a couple of congestion issues we wanted to address. Also, polling station availability is an ongoing concern. We've had a number of changes that we've had to make because of that. We wanted to address that too. These proposals are all shown in the appendices with maps showing the current and proposed polling schemes for those wards. We also, as part of the review, some proposals were made for Hillsey Ward by Councillors Scott Pater Harris and Russell Simpson, and those have also been included in the proposals in the report as well. Yeah, I mean, these proposals intended to be introduced from publication of the new 2023 electoral register in December, so they'll be in place for the May local elections.
Okay, thank you. Just, I wouldn't want him to feel left out. I wouldn't want Councillor Weems to feel left out. 5-4 says that he was also involved in the...
Indeed he was.
Thank you. Any questions or comments, members? No, well, John, I suspect if we want to change the whole lot, which we don't, it'll have to go out for more public consultation anyway, Ian. So I'll quickly ask members if they're happy with the recommendation. It wouldn't have to go out again, would it? Yeah?
We will keep these under review, and I think, there's a constant need to do so, and if, as circumstances change, we'll bring another set of proposals forward.
A lot of it to do with polling stations are no longer available, isn't it? You know, I mean, that's really what a lot of it's about.
That's correct.
Members, you're asked to note the changes to the current polling scheme recommended in 5.2 to 5.6 are approved and implemented on the publication of the 2023 register, and it be confirmed that the returning officer's delegated authority to make such variations to polling places as may be necessary arising from the availability of premises for use at a particular election. James has written down here, do I have a seconder? Yeah, thank you, Councillor Weems. Yeah. And is that recommendation, those recommendations agreed? Thank you, members. Thank you. Thanks very much, Ian. And item 10, internal audit performance status report to 31 August 2022. Lizzie, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Councillor. This is one of our normal reports that we're bringing to you. I do need to flag a couple of errors, unfortunately, so if I can pull your attention to page 95, where it states the progress against plan and the numbers. There are some errors, and there are 18 follow-up audits, and there are 16 grants currently, not 25. We have had an increase in grants since we submitted the plan for approval, which would have been back in March. But this particular report is stating that we are progressing with the areas identified in the audit plan. There are amendments which are noted under section 4. Predominantly, these amendments are to take account of an increase in follow-up work that needs to be performed and an increase in grants that need to be verified so that they can be signed off. Section 3, I just wanted to draw to your attention, we've included the level of cases that we're investigating, and I just want to flag again we're seeing a significant increase, which will ultimately have an impact on the resource and what we're able to cover from an audit perspective. Beyond that, on section 5, which is on page 99, I've given you an update on the critical exception that was raised, and this was in relation to supplier bank mandate changes. If we raise an exception that is critical, we need to do some follow-up work within 3 months. And this is narrating that there has been progress, which is a good thing. It's been a very short period of time since we've actually performed the original audit, but it's to note that there is progress in place, and that will continue. The other elements of the report which are determined from page 104 onwards would be section 8, which is telling you of any new full audits that we've performed in any grant work and the results of those particular areas. Our follow-up work is performed in 2 layers. We'll either do an initial follow-up. If there are outstanding actions, it will trigger a second follow-up. in agreement with the chair of this committee, if we have any actions that following a second review we've still not had traction, we will take those to the chief exec so that there can be a response provided by the chief executive. You'll note under section 9, I think 10, apologies, which is on page 114, of the 3 reviews that there has been a second follow-up. Emergency procedures was flagged last time, and that is positive in that the second review has closed down the exceptions. The only area that we've not had sufficient traction is in relation to the pilotage contract that we have in place. And the issue that is still outstanding in relation to that is fundamentally, unfortunately, on our contractor side. There are very few contractors out there, though, that can actually perform that particular service for us. So we are left trying to resolve and get the relevant contracts signed. In the scheme of things, though, there are other controls and arrangements that are in place. So between myself and my colleague Paul, we can answer any questions you may or may not have in relation to this particular report.
Okay, thank you very much, Lucy, for that. I just have a couple of questions here. I think I've asked them before, but just to reconfirm, I think they're in different terminology this time. The audit plan and changes, and a lot have been removed to accommodate additional grants and audit work. In fact, loads of them have. And our website one removed due to lack of resources from client. My fear is, as I've always said in the past, is that people are hiding them or don't want them done at a particular time. I mean, but that's just me. But what actually, why have they been removed for additional grants and audit work rather than an audit take place and say that, you know, the opportunity is applying for outside grants, is it?
Grants that are awarded to the organisation very often already have stipulated that there is a requirement to get them signed off. Now, when they are signed off, they may be at various levels. It may be a requirement for Section 151. Very often there's a requirement that audit undertake verification work, and I have to sign a statement alongside David Williams. A number of the grants, though, that we receive, central government hasn't given us the upfront information that there is something that's required to be signed off. So we have visibility around a number of the grants to which we can factor into the plan. But we have some grants where we get a notification at short notice from central government, and we've had a real flurry saying, by the way, we've got a month, and can we have your statement? Because we have no visibility of those, and because we physically have to submit a return, and we have had occasions when we haven't submitted a return and central government has said, give us back our money. So we have to factor those in. I think at previous meetings I've raised the fact that the grant work doesn't influence our opinion work, but it specifies Chief Internal Auditor and Chief Executive that need to sign them. So we don't have any option other than to perform them. And depending upon the nature of the grant, the transactions and level of transactions that sit underneath them can be pretty extensive. Does that answer?
Yes, and they're just off for the moment. They'll come back at some stage. Audits that have been removed will come back.
On a yearly basis, we carry out risk assessments to determine which areas we need to audit, and that's against the entire population of activities for the organisation as a whole. So, yes.
Thank you. And just one jumped out at me on page 98. Coffee shops. Follow on a high risk exception. I take it they're selling tea and not coffee or whatever. That's the high risk. But am I even stupid, or do we own coffee shops, or have we something to do with coffee shops?
When we performed the original audit, which from recollection is either 1920 or 2021, we had the view upstairs and we also had the hub. The view upstairs has since closed, but the hub has remained open, and that caters for members of staff within that area, but also members of the public. We deliberately didn't do any follow-up work during the pandemic because they were closed, or because when they were opened, it had very limited provisions. But at some stage, we're duty-bound to follow up on all areas where we have raised a high risk. So obviously, the work that we are going to perform for that will not include the view, because that is currently closed.
I'd forgotten about that, the view, whatever you call it, yeah. Lucy, I just note that in the exceptions raised, there were some very high ones. But I don't want to go into them in detail, because they'll stay on until they're resolved anyway, won't they, or come down. But there just seems to be quite a lot of high. Is this more than in the past, or is my mind playing silly bladders with me?
I don't believe it's any more than what we've historically had, but we do monitor that, and on an annual basis we will present to you comparisons against previous years.
Okay, thank you. Members, any questions, any points? Councillor Smythe, Judith?
I suppose similar to you, Chair. I mean, it looks to me, just looking at these titles on pages 97 and 98, that you've shifted from doing some quite important things that seem to have quite potentially big impact to lots of smaller things that may be very high risk but maybe aren't quite so big. Is that right? And I imagine that's rather inefficient for your team.
The grant work we can't get away from. We're going to have to do, irrespective of the value, if there's a requirement to sign. In relation to the ones that I take out of the plan, there is a rationale behind the ones that I move. So, for example, libraries for me is on the cusp as to whether there are significant areas for us to focus on. But we get to a stage that if we haven't looked at it for a number of years, we're duty-bound to do some work. You have other areas that are included in here, for example, council tax, expenses, etc., and accounts receivable, where we audit them on a regular basis. They can be quite extensive systems, so we're not auditing the same thing each time. So we can afford to perhaps not audit them in some years, which again is my motivation for taking them out. Bringing your own devices, I think Paul would probably be able to give a little bit of more narrative around the rationale for us taking those out. But there are some areas where it may look like they have significant risks, deprivation of liberty being one of them. But my judgment on that is we've audited them a few times. I've had discussions with the director in that particular area. Any work that we do in there now is probably not going to tell us anything different to what we have historically established, i.e. they are no doubt not going to be up to date with their assessments, because that is the current position across the country. So there is rationale behind why I take some of them out, but if you ever have concerns, more than happy to either have the conversation to explain or to take on board any other intelligence that we may have. But Paul, do you have any narrative around the bring your own device? I ought to have remembered, but apologies.
Yeah, on that one, that's a scheme that we've tried before and stopped before, and it's a scheme that we were told was coming back. It's not happening at the moment, but we will be involved in an advisory capacity throughout that project anyway. So it's one that we can advise on throughout the year and then look at in a future year to give way for obviously the grant work that comes in that we have to do this year.
Thank you for those explanations. It's good. I mean, I can understand the thinking behind that. If we're going to generally rely on more and more grants and there are going to be more and more requirements, then obviously you'll have to look at the resources implications of that, because we can't, some of these we can't push back infinitely. I'm sure you know that.
Okay, thank you, Judith. Any other members? Okay, members, thank you very much, Lucy and Paul. It recommended that we note the audit performance for 22-23 to 31st of August 22, and 2, the highlighted areas of concern in relation to audits completed for the 22-23 audit plan, including follow-up work performed. Is that agreed, members? Agreed. Thank you very much. Thank you. Although at the end of the meeting, as we said at the very first item, it's a 99% chance that we'll be seeking a special meeting of gas anyway within the next few weeks. So James and I will come up with some dates once we know what the cabinet members doing, the particular cabinet members doing, and then canvass you with dates, if that's okay. And just is morning best for people? Yeah, yeah. So maybe we look at more, because James, what I don't like is Democratic Service being stuck with 600 days that they have to try to whittle down. So we'll come up to it morning anyway at some stage. James, members, thank you very much. Thank you. And officers, sir.